Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we're continuing with our shirim on the Mitteler Rebbe Shaar HaYichud with the commentary of Rav Hillel Paritcher. And Be'ezras Hashem, today we're going to complete Os Aleph, which is going to bring us and give us a full understanding of the nature of thinking, the Chachma, the Bina, and the Daas. Thinking is composed of three elements. It's composed of Chachma, Bina, and Daas, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And we've described so far the two first stages of wisdom and understanding. We've described the initial burst of Chachma, which has within itself an Orech, a Rochev, and an Omek, and how from within the depth of Chachma, what emerges is the potentiation towards Bina, which is the Havein b'Chachma. And then when Bina emerges from within the original Muskal Rishon, that first thought of Chachma, it breaks down into its own tripartite breakdown of Omek, Rochev, and Omek, Rochev, and Orech of Bina itself, which is the ability to draw out the idea across the boundaries of itself, to expand it beyond its particular casing, as well as to draw it down vertically speaking by way of the metaphoricity of applying it to different levels of understanding. And that's the secret of Bina. And we discussed how there's a bina within Chachma, which is the shoresh of separation of thought within the holistic shape of thought, as well as the residual trace of the holistic Chachma within the separation of bina itself, and the secret of the Havein b'Chachma, the potentiation towards understanding within wisdom itself, which allows itself to become the wisdom within understanding. And then we came to understand, as the Mitteler Rebbe told us, is that the koach of bina is havanas hadavar mitoch davar. Bina has the ability of breaking up an idea and uncovering more from within that original idea. But as long as it's relegated to that original idea, Bina doesn't have the ability to renew something completely new. It could only renew that which is already present. But within the oimek of Bina, within the very depth of Bina, which is the secret of the keser of Bina, something gets accessed, which is the innermost point of Bina within Chachma, which brings us back to the capacity of Havein b'Chachma, which is the secret of the Bina that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted. This is the bina that doesn't only understand something from within itself, but it has the ability of understanding something new from within a new idea of chachma itself, not just a recycling of the old, but rather the recreation of something new. And that's what we spoke about on the level of bina. So nimsa. So now the Mitteler Rebbe is going to bring us back to the point that we want to get to, which is ultimately the main place of thinking, which is going to be das. Nimsa. It turns out then that the Seder HaMadregos Kachim, this is the way that it typically goes in the process of thinking. There's the Bechina of Iyun, the process of thinking, which the Mitteler Rebbe already said it's important to ensure that we don't get caught in the mistake of thinking that the process of thinking is identifiable with the desire and the intended goal of thought. The intended goal of thought is ha'amakas hadas. Most of the world identifies the process of iyun and bina with ha'amakas hadas, but that's not what ha'amakas hadas is. Ha'amakas hadas, the deepening of knowledge, as we're going to see, is something completely separate and apart from the process of understanding. The depth of understanding, the oimek of bina, which most people refer to as ha'amakas hadas, or the capacity to meditate intentively on something, is something else entirely. Bina and the way of thinking is just the vessel that enables us to access that place. So the first level is the iyun, which is the ability to stand upon a topic with depth, which is bina, which is not allowing myself to go quickly into something, but rather to slowly but surely understand all of the applications of this pre-existing idea. That's the bina of bina, which is the ability to be mavchin, the tachlis ha'havchana b'pnimius v'chitzonius, the ability to take that postulate of thought, that point of insight, and to break it down into its bite-sized, manageable parts, and to understand it more and more. The gamizeh yochol lohios b'chinas ha'oirich lahoirid ha'hasaga b'levushim rabim ad shetitgashim l'hasaga satinuk. And then from within that bina of bina, from within my ability to understand the particular idea, I could also uncover the secret of the chachma within bina itself. The bina of bina is the iyun. The chachma of bina is the ability to extend it downwards as well as expand it outwards. And from within the first stage of iyun and the bina of bina, which is just the deepening of my understanding of the particular elements of the idea, gam mizeh yachol lios b'chinas ha'orech. The vertical extension by way of metaphoricity and the ability to draw the idea that is grasped down in different garments so that it can come down to the knowledge of even a child, as we described earlier, that's already contained within the bina shebabina. But a person has not yet accessed the ability to take that idea that they now understand and extend it in a horizontal way so that it can now apply itself across the board. L'chol tzad. And at that point, we draw down the chachma of bina, which is the ability to draw something new out of that idea within a particular hasaga aleph. It's the harschavchus of the nahar. It's the ability of taking that original idea of bina, which I've now understood in its depth, with the ability of extending it across the board. That is where all of the ability of bina comes from, which enables us to create the oirech and the rochev. Aval shir ha'oirech v'ha'rochev, the chub. But when it comes to the orich and the rochev of chachma and bina within bina itself, those first two levels of bina, the orich, which is the ability to apply it by way of metaphors, and the rochev, which is the ability to extend it beyond its particular casing and setting, all of those things are ultimately dependent on the innermost point of bina, which is the oimek hamusag, the depth of contemplation, the depth of understanding, the innermost point of understanding. Shenikra keser de bina. That's referred to as the keser of bina, ukeshenira bechush, like we see in our own process of thinking. Shelafi erech ha'oimek, that in accordance with the depth of which I'm attaching my mind to this particular idea, so too it's going to express itself in the vertical extension of the idea as well as in the horizontal extension of the idea. Each thing matters and depends upon the oimek hamusag. So we see that there are the three stages of bina. There's the bina within bina, there's the chachma within bina, and there's the keser within bina, and the chachma and the bina within bina, and the ability to understand the particular process of understanding in its depth is ultimately rooted in the keser of bina, which is the original expression of that point, which descends down from the bina within chachma, which is the secret of the burgeoning possibility of separation within unity itself. Zakt the Heilige Mitteler Rebbe. Ulafiza, now the Mitteler Rebbe is going back and expressing again what the issue is with mistaking the process of thinking with the goal of thinking. That most of the world, Masha Koiram Ha'ilam Ha'amaka Sadas, Ein ze gufo shel ha'amaka kamo omek hamusag debina. Shelazeh lo yesh shaychus ladas. Ach hadas hu b'chinas eskashrus hargashosa b'musag biyoter. B'husha mevi lidei b'chinas ha'amaka b'musag acher b'chinas ha'iyon hanizka la'el shirak kamo b'chinas kli lo omek hasaga kanal. Now, just to translate it, the Mitteler Rebbe is saying most of the world thinks that ha'amaka sadas, the depth of meditation, is identifiable and synonymous with the deepening of bina. But in truth, ha'amaka sadas has absolutely nothing to do with the process of grasping the depth of bina, because when it comes with grasping the depth of bina through the keser chachma and bina of bina, which is the oirech, the rochev, and the omek of bina, that has no relationship to das. Das is a completely separate entity of the mind. What das truly is, unlike the thinking process and the contemplation process that bina provides, what das truly is the element of hiskashrus, hargashosav b'musag. It's the attachment of my feelings to the idea, or the idea to my feelings, as the Baal Tanya describes in Perek Gimel, that das is hiskashrus. It's not simply a process of thinking. It doesn't remain cerebral like Chachma and Bina do, but rather it has the power and the potency to break through the body and the brain divider, which separates the mind from the body. And it has the ability of drawing down insight down into the lived experience. That's what das is. It's got nothing to do with the external shape of thinking associated with Bina. And it's not what ha'amaka sadas is. Bina is the opportunity, and it's the setup for us to then descend down into the secret of ha'amaka sadas, but not like the rest of the world who identifies the depth of Bina with the depth of ha'amaka sadas. That's identifying the setup behavior with the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal, the Mitteler Rebbe says, is to connect oneself to the pnimius of Das, and that only takes shape once Bina is properly set up, but Bina being properly set up is not identifiable with ha'amaka sadas. Contemplation is not the same as meditation. Attaching myself more and more with my whole self to the idea. And that's what enables me to deepen my connection to the idea that has just been contemplated by way of Bina. But that's only after the element of Iyun, which is the element of all of those moichin of Bina, which are only a kli to the oimek of the hasaga. So the Mitteler Rebbe is once again reminding us that when it comes to the oimek, the rochev, and the oirech of Bina, that is not what ha'amaka sadas is. A person can spend a lot of time contemplating by way of extending it horizontally, vertically, deepening my understanding of it, finding its roots in Chachma, nevertheless, that's the act of contemplation, that's hisbonenus, and it's not ha'amakas hadas, which is ultimately drawing something down into the depth of hasaga. Das is something completely separate. So we saw that there's the oimek, the roichev, and the oirech of Chachma, and it's the oimek of Chachma that gives birth to the oimek of bina, which then gives birth to the oimek roichev and oirech of bina, and then we're going to come to the third triad of thinking, which is Das. It's Chachma, Bina, and Das. Chachma is the initial thought, Bina is the processing and the understanding to that thought, and then Das is going to be the connection at the end of the day to that thought. The gam das, says the Mitteler Rebbe. When it comes to Das, there's also an oirech, a roichev, and an oimik, just like Chachma and Bina. When we properly understand not to mistake the depth of Bina with the depth of Das, and we identify Das as a third possibility of the mind, a different way of processing. So then we see that just like the other three elements, just like the other two elements of mind, Chachma and Bina, have their own tripartite breakdown of the elongation downwards, the elongation outwards, and the depth of the matter, the oirich, the reichev, and the omik. So too, that's going to take shape in Das itself. Kamo yesh misha daiso ketzera v'yesha daiso arucha. There are those who have a long span of attentional Das, and there are those who have a shortened span of attentional Das. Yesh shadaiso rachva v'yesh v'lo arucha v'das chazak o das kal. There are those who have the possibility of extending their Das by way of horizontal growth, and there are those who have the possibility of extending their Das by way of vertical growth. There are those who have strong Das, and there are those who have a soft Das, like the Nashim Shadaisam Kalos, who built the Oimek Das without descending down or penetrating into the depth of the matter. Umemela Daiso Katsera, and someone who doesn't descend down into the depth of the matter is ultimately not going to have the deep connection to the matter. V'hefresh zeh ben Kale Hadas la'Oimke Hadas ben Gadol la'Katon Yadua shahatinok shadaiso kal henu she'in bo koach hamargish v'hiskashrus klal ledavar zeh What's the difference between a light form of Das and a deep form of Das? Das is the descent down into the very interiority of the idea itself. It's not trying to understand the idea, it's connecting my ratzon to the idea. It's attaching myself in a far more urgent and subterranean way that is going to at least externally appear to be lower, but in its roots is going to be rooted in a higher place. Ha'amakas hadas is an embodied form of knowledge, something that is far less powerful and exciting externally than Chachma and Bina, but far more internal and interior and intimate than the externalities of Chachma and Bina. Das is his kashrus. It takes place underneath the process of thinking. It's where I'm no longer trying to understand the matter, but I'm trying to connect myself by way of ratzon, by way of attachment, by becoming attached and wedged to this idea so that it becomes something that's almost like a felt sense. It's a chush, as we're going to see. Das is rooted in a place that's prior to the beginning of consciousness, and then it slowly but surely expresses itself by way of the gradations across the spectrum of Chachma and Bina. But Das, whenever we find it, is always going to be reflective of that unspoken power that transcends contemplation and wisdom and touches upon the embodied attachment to the idea so that the idea itself descends down into the depth of the individual and it can be lived in accordance to. That's B'das Chadarim Yimla'u. The Tachlis is not the mind. The Tachlis is to draw the mind down across the brain-body barrier and to allow it to melt into the midos and to nahi so that something real can be revealed. That's the koyach of Das. And we said there's a difference between one who has strong Das and one who has a small form of Das. So for example, a child who doesn't have a matured form of Das, their attachment to an idea is not going to be such a thick attachment. And therefore, even if they feel attached to an idea, nevertheless, easily one can come and change their minds because the attachment, the Das that they feel, and that connection of the Ratzon and the Leiv, as strong as it is, it can also be shifted by shifting attention. But when it comes to a strong form of Das, when a person has Tekiyas Hadas and a person has kind of entrenched their knowledge and they have that Miyom Omda Al Daisi, where a person has their real knowledge of what's true for themselves, then that's how the wisdom of Chachma and the understanding of Bina gets translated in accordance with their own idiom, with their own felt sense. And it's not going to be easy to shift the person away from that. When a person has the deepening of Das in a real mature way, that's something that is not easily changeable. We can't easily change a person's mind. So we see the gradations of Das have a profound impact on the way in which a person is actually going to relate to an idea. that when a person has kale hadas, la'oimke hadas, the separation between someone who has great das or small das is just, for example, like a child who has a very small level of das, and therefore their feeling of a felt connection to the matter under discussion, to the idea that they're discussing or trying to understand or that they want, is only external. It's a very external and weak form of deep connection. And therefore, they can be seduced or convinced away from it to attach themselves to the opposite just as quickly. Masha'ein kein hagadol shebedaiso amuk ba'oise hadavar shemevin orot sebo hu hanikra ha'amaka sadas. But when it comes to the depth of das, when it comes to someone who has truly developed the attachment to draw the wisdom down through the process of understanding into the felt sense of das, a person like that has a deepening of das, which means that they truly understand what they want, and they want what they want, and they know that that's what they want, and they're not going to be moved away from it. And that's referred to as ha'amakas hadas, a deepening of das. That's not identifiable with bina. It's what takes place after bina. Shememela nimshach oirech hadas v'roichev hadas kenizka la'el bebina v'simin laha'amakas hadas hu asher nira ke'inyin hatzimsum v'kivutz. So the Mitteler Rebbe is explaining to us now why is it that so many people came to mistake ha'amakas habina in the process of contemplation with ha'amakas hadas, which is meditation and the attachment to the idea. So the Mitteler Rebbe is saying that ultimately das does follow bina. It does come after bina. So if I just spent a lot of time contemplating something, ba'oimek, ba'oirechu, ba'roichev, so memela, most naturally, that thing that I've been contemplating is likely going to be the thing that I want to have ha'amakas hadas on, that I want to contemplate, meditate, and draw down into my lived experience. But it's not synonymous with it. The Mitteler Rebbe is saying, obviously, if I've just spent all of my time contemplating, that contemplated idea is going to be the thing that I choose to meditate upon, thereby creating an externalized unity between bina and das, because das comes from bina, but nevertheless, they represent two separate things. But the fact that they come from the same place means that they're going to ultimately look similar to one another. And ha'amakas hadas, externally, nira ke'inyan simsum v'kivutz. Just like bina, we said, is the process of standing upon the matter and not allowing my mind to race, but rather to hold myself back and to be ma'amid and to be mispoinin and to look at the matter twice and to stand upon something with patience so that I can properly understand it. At first glance, that act of the tzimtzum of thought seems to be applied to das as well, because bina leads to das. Kli hamoyach, it's the secret of the closing off of the kli hamoach la'oitzem oimek hiskashruso b'mushkal. It's diminishing the extent at which my mind thinks about things and hyper focusing in on a particular point of which the mind would like to attach itself to at this point. That is what bina looks like. And das also looks like that. Shemizeh dafka ba oitzem oimek hahasoga al yedei ha'iyun de bina shu hepech hatzimtzum va'kivutz. But in truth, the fact that in bina there was a stoppage point, and that in das there's a stoppage point. The stoppage point, the tzimtzum of bina and the tzimtzum of das in the process of thinking are fundamentally different from one another. Yes, bina demanded more attention, but once we paid attention, it's no longer a stoppage of thought, but rather it's the extension of thought. Bina has an oimek, an oirich, and a reichiv to it, and it's the attempt to be maven davar mitoch davar. So while bina represents a slowing down of the mind and a tzimtzum and a kivutz of the mind, nevertheless, it's not stopping. It's actually extending itself across the boundary of what can be understood. And therefore the Mitteler Rebbe says that we see that the oimek hamusag of das comes about through the iyun of bina, which yes, demands a person to stand upon and be patient, but nevertheless it's the opposite of the tzimtzum and the kivutz that das provides, because tzimtzum and the kivutz that das provides is not slowing down to look at something with slow and steady contemplation, but it's a constriction of the mind to the extent that all that remains afterwards is the innermost point of das. That's a very different type of tzimtzum. It's a collection of all of the possibilities of thought into one singular condensed point of that which is thought and that which is known. That's the tzimtzum and the kivutz of das. That's very different than the tzimtzum and the kivutz of bina, which is, yes, a slowing down, but not a standing upon the particular point. That's only shayach by chachma itself. So now inside the Mitteler Rebbe, once we have the ha'amada and the stoppage and the slowness of the iyun de bina, that's in truth the opposite of the tzimtzum and the kivutz. Why? It's not a constriction of thought. It's not minimizing things down to one singular point of das. Shaar ha'iyun de bina, gam she'oimeru ma'ukav b'tzimtzum v'kivutz b'tchilaso. Even though we already said that when it comes to the process of bina, a person has to be patient and stand upon their ground and not allow the mind to run forward like a muskal rishon of chachma. Nevertheless, aval miyad mispashet l'roichiv harbe b'chol pratei chelkav v'havchanas pratius harbe ki yadua. Nevertheless, once I've stopped my mind to pay attention to that which is there in bina, the mind then immediately shifts into that expansion mode where it's extending itself horizontally and vertically in accordance with all of the particulars. And that's the opposite of tzimtzum. That's the proliferation of details rather than the constriction of the mind and the reducing of the mind down to its most inner point, which is real das. When it comes to the real tzimtzum and the kivutz and the containment of the mind that comes about with the deepening of das and the meditation upon that singular point, adarabba, it's the opposite of the ha'amaka of bina. Hu rak hatzimtzum shu hakibutz v'ha'atzifa mikol koyach siklo leskasher rak b'muskal zeh, shezeh hepech b'chinas espashtus ha'iyan b'harchavas inyan hamuskal. The depth of ha'amaka sadas and the tzimtzum of ha'amaka sadas is the reducing of all thinking down to the irreducible point that remains centered, and it's the attentional point of intentional connection to the degree that everything else is silence. That ha'makas das, that meditative quality of das b'pnimiuso, is very different than the tzimtzum that's demanded by bina. Yes, bina demands more attention, and it means slowing down because I move too fast in the realm of chachma, and I need to make the moment of chachma last. That slow down, you move too fast, you have to make the moment last. Slow down, you move too fast is the secret of bina, and the moment is chachma, and the only way to make the moment of chachma last is through the slowing down of bina. But the slowing down of bina is not the cessation of thinking or the constriction of thinking to the point that it is contained within the potency of an irreducible and infinitesimal dot that contains the potential of all, like ha'amakas das does. It's rather a slowing down for the sake of continuing to expand the mind. But when it comes to that meditative connection of the pnimius hadas, then it's adarabba. We're not extending ourselves outwards like the harchavas ha'inyan hamuskal, like we saw in bina, because amnan alidei ha'amakas hadas. Nevertheless, ha'amakas hadas, when I descend down into that deepening of my thought, which is the condensing all things into one singular point, then what I come to find is ba'alidei amkus hamuskal ad sherashe ba'amke hachub. What the Mitteler Rebbe is hinting to here is that, yes, Das is the lowest of the triad of thinking, Chachma, Bina, and Das, and it seems to be the thing that composes the unity between Chachma and Bina, which appears to be lower. But nevertheless, because Das has the singular capacity to contain opposites, as well as that ability to descend down into the pinpoint, essential, quintessential expression of the idea, that's because Das is rooted in a place that's really loftier than Chachma and Bina. Das is rooted in Keser. Das is the externality of Keser. And so, yes, the lower elements of Das Tachton seems to synthesize Chachma and Bina to provide the ability to truly meditate on the idea. Nevertheless, that capacity to meditate on the quintessential element of the idea is rooted in the pnimius of Das, which is the Das Ne'elam, as we're going to see, which is in truth rooted in between Chachma and Bina, as well as higher than Chachma and Bina, in the secret of a felt sense. It's something that is prior to contemplation, prior to wisdom already. The self has its predetermined sense of self and the sense of a feeling that it wants to identify these particular processes and these particular modes of light in its life. And therefore, the felt sense that precedes the acts of contemplation, those elements of the unconscious Keser within each and every one of us, that's already there even prior to Chachma and Bina emerging. And then that Das finds itself after Chachma and Bina emerge, and it rests at the synthesizing center of Chachma and Bina in its finalization. So we see that the lowest part of Das, which seems to be the lowest triad of thinking, is nevertheless capable of its unique ability to synthesize the wholeness of Chachma and the partiality of Bina into that quintessential drop of insight that can be contemplated upon by depth to draw it down into lived experience. That capacity by Das is there because in truth, Das in its inner interiority is rooted in a place far higher than the external points of Chachma and Bina. And that's why that through the Ha'amakas HaDas, through descending down into the oimek of Das, which is the quintessential point of contemplation that is meditative in its nature, a person can come bali de amkus hamuskal. Then a person can come to the depth of the matter, to the source of chachma and bina themselves. Ad bechinas das elyon. They can go all the way back from das tachton to das elyon, which is the secret of the zivug between chachma and bina. Kamoisha kasvu lomala beinyan oimek hamusa de bina dahainu de das gones befuma de ima. Kamoisha amarnu moisha shu das zachal bina shu Shaar nun ki haba hatalia kamoisha kasvu bechsaven bekama duchte. So what the Mitteler Rebbe is hinting here is that in spite of the fact that Das seems to be lower than chachma and bina, and it seems to be the lower expression of Das, which is the synthesis and the quintessential drop of chachma and bina, nevertheless, because it's coming from bina, we just described earlier that even though bina doesn't have the ability to reach up into the realms of chachma, nevertheless, all capacity of bina in truth does come from that place of havein b'chachma, which is the secret of the potentiation of separation and bina within the infinite whole of chachma. And therefore, if Das comes from bina, and bina in truth is rooted in the loftiest places of chachma, like we saw earlier, that it does have the ability to bring us back to that place of the bina that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted. So then Das also, by way of its connection to bina, has the ability to go all the way up to the amkei hasharashim of chachma and bina. And this is the secret that the Mitteler Rebbe is hinting to here, where he says that the Das Elyon has the ability to be mechaber chachma and bina, and bring a person to the inner interiority of bina, which is the secret of the das that is hidden within the mouth of bina. That bina contains the possibility of das, which is why they seem similar externally, why they both seem to operate in accordance to the tzimtzum, and why there could be such a mistaken perspective where the rest of the world thinks that the amkus of bina is ultimately the amkus of das, because ultimately there is a hidden relationship between the two of them. Kamosha Amr Moshe Shua Das, that Moshe Rabbeinu is das, and he was also zoichet to bina. What does it mean? If he's Das, why is he Zoichet to Bina? It means that he was Zoichet to the Shaar Hanun of Bina, which is the Havein B'Chachma, the secret of the rooted nature of Bina within Chachma, Ki Haba Hatalia Kamosha Kasav B'Chsavim B'Kamei Duchte. And so now, what we see is that the purpose of all of this, the oimek, the roichev, and the oirech of chachma, the oimek, the roichev, and the oirech of bina, are ultimately to bring us to the oimek, the roichev, and the oirech of das, and ultimately to the oimek of das, which is the secret quintessential point of tzimtzum, which contains all that was just thought and all that was just postulated, and the possibility of das, which operates below chachma and bina, in the midbrain, kind of in the lower element, beneath chachma and bina, is ultimately because das, in its inner interiority, in truth, is both rooted in the inside of bina, which is rooted in the inside of chachma, but also in a hidden way, das is rooted in the interiority of keser, which is far higher than even chachma and bina alone, which is this felt sense. So now what we're going to look at are some of the lashonos of Rav Hillel Paracher when it comes to properly understanding this element of das. So Rav Hillel Paracher says as follows: the shorish hadas, the root of das. What's the root of das? Das is dependent upon a person who has a true sense of something, a true sense. That it's just like when you see somebody who, even prior to their expression of their chesed, or prior to them doing something, it's just fundamentally clear that their self is rooted in chesed, and that determines the source of their desire, and that's always going to be the framework in which they see things, always in the element of chesed v'tov. This is rooted ultimately in the das, in the chush, that's rooted in keser, that precedes all chachma and bina. Makor hazehu moiled etzla gilei ratzon lechesed. It creates within the person a desire towards always looking towards chesed and goodness, betmidius, in a perpetual state. But this chush, this orientation towards thinking, this felt sense that exists by way of the unconsciousness of keser, it's only revealed later on through the light of das. But in its source, this hiskashrus sheyesh lo bebechinas haratzon be'ez sherotze is referred to as a chush. It's referred to as a sense. And bechinas hachush hanal, this felt sense prior to contemplation, prior to wisdom, prior to knowing anything, having always already known the direction in which we would like our souls to go, this has the ability of being poyel etzlo achar kach hahiskashrus bahasichliim. Once I have this predetermined unconscious state of pnimius hadas, which is the chush, that felt sense prior to expression, prior to articulation, that later on expresses itself in the process of thinking, when things descend down from their essential nature, or I come to understand the different reasons and come to understand the process in which it came from, which is Chachma and Bina. And ultimately, that's going to be revealed in Das itself. But what we see here is that the Chush, this pre-orientation towards a felt sense and an embodied knowledge of how we want the wisdom of the Torah to speak to us, the secret of the neshama that's melamed the person, the Torah itself, the Torah that a person learned before coming into this world, the particular mark of their soul, their particular das, which is unique and different than everybody else. Chachma and Bina can be similar across the board. But when it comes to the Iker Nekuda Pnimius Hadas, which is the particular idiom through which that individual is going to draw down their understanding, that's something that's rooted in the pre-linguistic, pre-thought process of a chush, which is referred to as the inner light of Keser, the Zion Tikkunim of Arich Anpen that are mislabish within Chachma and Bina. Those things that predetermine the things that have not yet even begun to be determined. And slowly but surely, down the progressional process of thinking, it's going to express itself in a lower level of das, which is the ability to draw out of the Chachma and Bina that quintessential point. But what is the quintessential point? That's rooted in the Das HaNe'elam, which is ultimately the hislabshus of Keser within Chachma and Bina, which is the pnimius of Das, the pnimius of Keser, which gives me the directionality that I seek. Zok the Helaga Rav Hillel. V'hinei, Shoresh Hadas, the real source of Das, hu lamala mechachma v'bina kiyadua. In truth, it's much higher than Chachma and Bina. Sheyesh beis bechinas, because in truth there are two elements. There's Das Elyon and there's Das Tachton. Hine bechinas Das Tachton. What's the lower level of Das? Hu lamata mechachma v'bina. It's what operates below Chachma and Bina, v'humashem makasher es atzmo b'hasagaso shehisig kvar b'moyach binaso v'rotzelim soa hevchen mimena umizeh noilad b'chinas hamido shabahasaga ubayim misham lidei gilui b'leiv. So when it comes to the lower das is once I've understood something from within Chachma itself, I already know what I know. And therefore, I want to now draw it down from my bina into my heart by way of the midos, bedas chadarim yimla'u. And that's the secret of the lower das, which connects Chachma and Bina. Aval bechinas das elyon, but the higher level of das, yesh bo kama bechinos. There's a number of expressions of das. Firstly, there's the bechina of das that's miyachid Chachma v'bina, that has the ability of being mechaber Chachma v'bina. That point of connection between the bina within Chachma and the Chachma within Bina is the secret of that Pnimius Hadas, which operates lower than Chachma but above Bina. So the first Das Tachton we said is beneath Chachma and Bina. Then the first Shlav of Das Elyon is above Bina but beneath Chachma, and it allows for the connection between the whole and the part of Chachma and Bina. Once I already know the idea, which is the secret of Chachma, but I have yet to draw it down into the settled nature of my mind because I don't have the letters of contemplation. So then, once I have the previously known idea that is yet to enter into the linguistic register of my graspability, so there's a Das Elyon, the first instantiation of Das Elyon, which is above the Das Tachyon, has the ability of drawing the Muskal Harishon of Chachma into the Muskal Sheni and the Hezber Hanigla of Bina. But in truth, there's a second stage of Das Elyon, which is even above Chachma. That's where it's rooted in the Keser. It's prior to knowing anything, but it's the state of wanting to know something. What a person is doing is they're attaching themselves to the very depths of their own minds itself, not the content of the mind, but the depth of the mind, the seichel itself. It's at that point that the essential nature of thought and the mind is awoken from within its hibernation, and this is referred to as a chachma that's above the chachma of the mind. The innermost point of das is an unfelt, unknown process of already knowing and already feeling something prior to the process. That's the chush. Ach ikar bechinas hadas bechinas is kashrus b'muhutz v'atzmus hadavar mitzad hargashos yokro v'chashivuso v'hargasha zos u'ba'atzmus hanefesh mamish. And in truth, this lofty level of das, which is that chush prior to awareness, also expresses itself in the lowest expression of das, which is, like we said, the deep connection that one one has to the essence of the matter by way of the felt sense of its value and its significance and the feeling that this is what they want to move forward with. That's the atzmas hanefesh and das shemach mazeh noiled etzlo b'chinas oineg. And in that shorish of das, what is awoken is the recesses of keser, which is the pleasure that one has prior to the process of thinking when they know that they're going to find something that's going to fit within their worldview. And that ratzon, that joy that I find when with that prescribed nature of that orientation towards thinking, that chush, that inner light of Kesser that rests within Chachma and Bina, so that's going to actually determine the timidiyut of my attentional space. The reason that I perpetually want to think in a certain way is ultimately rooted in the recesses of Das, which is the original thought of the emergence of the Seichel itself, which is the setting of intentions for where that felt sense of knowledge is going to go. V'nimsa, and it turns out the Bechina of Das is poyel hamshachas atzmius hadavar b'bechinas ha'oineg v'ratzon. At the very beginning of it, prior to contemplation, prior to anything being known, but the unknown unknowns of Das in its unconscious processing, the revelation of Kesser within the self, it awakens within the self the desire to draw down the essence of the self by way of pleasure and desire, the two correlative experiences of Kesser. The inyan gilui haratzon shebenefesh b'tmidius, and once I've attached my Das to the thing that I would like and the perpetual expression of that thing that I would like within my soul at every moment, this is referred to as a chush. It's a sense. It's prior to anything thought. It's prior to anything understood. It's represented as the hislabshus of arich within Chachma and Bina. Like the Rav Hillel Parcher says that he heard from Rav Zion Zion. I want to see who Zion Zion is. He heard this. He's quoting this twice. This nature that in its pnimius, the das, represents a chush that's prior to chachma and prior to bina, but rather it's the pre-orientation, the preset orientation of my thinking prior to any thinking, which ultimately determines the desire and the balance in which my thoughts are going to take shape. So let's see what Rav Hillel Parcher is quoting over here. Give me a second. I just want to see if he gives us a name. Here we go. Harav Zion Zion Rav Zalman Zazmir Rabo Shel Rav Hillel La'erech Taf Kuf Chaf Gimel to Taf Kuf Chaf Ches in Teves. In the beginning, he was a Makurav to the Admor Hazakin, and then he became a Makurav to the Admor HaEmsai, and the Rebbe Rayatz writes about him. Okay, so this is where that idea was coming from, that this innermost Das of Keser, which is the Sharish Das, is referred to as a chush. It's a felt sense prior to actual thinking. And this chush, Rav Zalman, what this chush is in truth the 7 rectifications of Keser as it's mislabesh within our Chachma and Bina, meaning to say shehim bechinas chushim shalamalam and haseichel. It's a felt sense prior to any contemplation. Hainu lehiyosim kli l'ratzon v'kelim nikra b'shem tikunim. The reason they're referred to as tikunim because these are the vessels of the mind that shape the desire of thought rather than thought itself. And they precede all processing, and that's das in its interiority. V'hine kefi hachush, in accordance with this inner unfelt sense, sheyesh lo bazeh hadavar, ki nimshach etzlo b'chinas es kashrus lahaskila lahasigo shezel b'chinas das hamamshich b'chinas chachma me'lamala min hachachma. So this chush, which is the innermost place of Das, says Rav Hillel, is ultimately going to enable a person to draw down the first expression of Chachma, to connect oneself to Chachma, which is the Das Elyon that rests above Chachma and Bina, and then to draw Das down from there with a further desire to draw it down from Chachma from above Chachma down into Chachma itself, and then from Chachma itself into Bina, which are all referred to still as Das Elyon. And Machma Zen, as a result of this, Nemshach Achar Kach Bechinas Das, and because it rests at the apex, it comes down to the lowest place where it serves as Das to connect and combine the Hasaga of Bina, which it drew down from Chachma, into the Midas of the Leiv, which is how we want to actually live our lives in accordance with our Das. And then that gives shape to the sense of the emotional embodiment of Das. So Nimtza, says Rav Hillel, it turns out that the Bechina of the Seichel Henikra Chachma itself is just a hispashtus from the Etzem, which is referred to as the concealment of Das, which is nothing other than the knowledge of the existence of my own mind, which is unlike the Das that takes shape lower on, which is taking shape at secondary levels. עצם מציאוס עניין ולא באיכוסם בפרט מה שאין כן כאשר נגלה איכוס העניין שמזה נמשך בכינס סבר נגלס להלבש לעצם מציאוס ההשכלה באויסיס פרטים רבים שזו גם כן בכינס ספשטס מעצם ההשכלה ונעשה כמוי לבוש אליו. And then the Rav Hillel is going on and explaining to us ultimately that even though it's only Das that is going to give us that innermost look into that essential place of the chush prior to Chachma and Bina, which enables me to then draw it down into actualized experience with the idea itself so that it can break free into my midos and have a real impact on my life. So Chachma also has that access point to bring us back to that unknown, undetermined place, but Bina doesn't. But in accordance with what the Mitteler Rebbe said before, everything that Chachma has, Bina can have also in the secret of having b'Chachma. So in truth, Das is what's being discussed most explicitly here, that the Das, which is the culmination of a thinking process, which is simply the synthesis of Chachma and Bina, which then allows me to draw the Chachma into my heart, which gets drawn down into the midos of the heart, which is the Shorish of Zer Anpin and the Shorish of being an individual in this world. That lowest expression of Das is rooted in a higher level of Das, which is the ability to connect Chachma and Bina, which is rooted in an even higher level of Das, which precedes Chachma itself, which is rooted in the potentiation of Keser, which is the Helbash of the Zayin Tikkunim de Golgalta, which is the chush, the tendency towards thought, which is going to determine the valence of my thought as it becomes consciously thought and as it descends down in the process of thinking. So in truth, there's a ratzon b'li tam that precedes all reasonable thoughts, and it expresses itself finally in the ability to draw that unreasonable thing that I know I truly need into my life through the process of Chachma, Bina, and Das. And with that, we're going to be ready, Be'ezras Hashem, to go to the next os, where now that we have the setup of the mind, the Mitteler Rebbe is now going to give us an insight into the true nature of Bina and the split off of Bina and Tvuna, which is then how we actually draw the ideas down into our hearts and into our midos, and then ultimately down to Malchus, which is going to be the tachlis of all things, which is seeing Hashem in the lowest place imaginable. And then the Mitteler Rebbe is going to bring us, now that we have the shape of the mind, now we're going to then go into the particular details of the Seder Ishtalshalis, from the Rosh of the Rosh down to the Sof of the Sof, and it's going to give us a full picture, but also now that we're armed, Be'ezras Hashem, with that sense of the chush hapnimi of Das, and the knowledge that essentially the goal of all of this is to draw it down into the quintessential drop of something that I can contemplate and draw into my life in a real way to bring more light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu into my life.